Hey you guys, Jelana Ray here, and I'm back with the fourth reading of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And last time, yesterday, at this time, 2 p.m. Pacific time, we read about the 3 phases of the inmate's prisoner of war mental reaction to camp life. The first period being the admission, and the second period being when he is well entrenched in the routine of it, and the third period being following the release. So we read about the first period, which he described as a state of shock, and gave his own account of admission into Auschwitz, into the concentration camp. And today we're going to get into phase 2, or the part where a prisoner gets entrenched. So at the end of yesterday's reading, a more experienced inmate had come into the new arrivals, including Viktor Frankl, and told them to remember to shave, stand tall, and walk smartly, and then you need not be afraid. But then he pointed to everybody and he said, all of you need not fear the gas. The only of all of you that he, meaning Viktor, pointing at Viktor, is the only one who must fear the next selection, so don't worry. And Viktor Frankl said that the only thing he could do at that point was smile. And that's where we ended yesterday's reading. So today, we're going to get back into it. I think it was Lessing who once said, "There are things which must cause you to lose your reason, or you have none to lose." An abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. Even we psychiatrists expect the reactions of a man to an abnormal situation, such as being committed to an asylum, to be abnormal in proportion to the degree of his normality. The reaction of a man to his admission to a concentration camp also represents an abnormal state of mind. But judged objectively, it's a normal and, as will be shown later, a typical reaction to the given circumstances. These reactions, as I've described them, began to change in a few days. The prisoner passed from the first to the second phase, the phase of relative apathy, in which he achieved a kind of emotional death. Side note, I'm going to forewarn you that this part of the reading is pretty detailed in what they experience, and it's a little disturbing, so I just want to warn you. Apart from the already described reactions, the newly arrived prisoner experienced the tortures of other most painful emotions, all of which he tried to deaden. First of all, there was his boundless longing for his home and his family. This often could become so acute that he felt himself consumed by longing. Then there was disgust with all the ugliness which surrounded him, even in its mere external forms. Most of the prisoners were given a uniform of rags, which would have been made a scarecrow elegant by comparison. Between the huts in the camp lay pure filth, and the more one worked to clear it away, the more one had to come in contact with it. It was a favorite practice to detail a new arrival to a work group whose job was to clean the latrines and remove the sewage. If, as usually happened, some of the excrement splashed into his face during its transport over bumpy fields, any sign of disgust by the prisoner, or any attempt to wipe off the filth, would only be punished with a blow from a capo, and thus the mortification of normal reactions was hastened. At first the prisoner looked away if he saw the punishment parades of another group. He could not bear to see fellow prisoners march up and down for hours in the mire, their movements directed by blows. Days or weeks later, things changed. Early in the morning, when it was still dark, the prisoner stood in front of the gate with his detachment, ready to march. He heard a scream and saw how a comrade was knocked down, pulled to his feet again, and knocked down once more. And why? He was feverish, but had reported to sickbay at an improper time. He was being punished for this irregular attempt to be relieved of his duties. But the prisoner who had passed into the second stage of his psychological reactions did not avert his eyes any more. By then his feelings were blunted and he watched unmoved. Another example, He found himself waiting at sickbay, hoping to be granted 2 days of light work inside the camp because of injuries or perhaps edema or fever. He stood unmoved while a 12-year-old boy was carried in who had been forced to stand at attention for hours in the snow or to work outside with bare feet because there were no shoes for him in the camp. His toes had become frostbitten, and the doctor on duty picked off the black, gangrenous stumps with tweezers, one by one. Disgust, horror, and pity are emotions that our spectator could not really feel anymore. The sufferers, the dying and the dead, became such commonplace sights to him after a few weeks of camp life that they could not move him anymore. I spent some time in a hut for typhus patients who ran very high temperatures and were often delirious, many of them moribund. After one of them had just died, I watched without any emotional upset the scene that followed, which was repeated over and over again with each death. One by one, the prisoners approached the still warm body. One grabbed the remains of a messy meal of potatoes. Another decided that the corpse's wooden shoes were an improvement on his own and exchanged them. A third man did the same with the dead man's coat, and another was glad to be able to secure some, just imagine this, genuine string. All this I watched with unconcern. Eventually, I asked the nurse to remove the body. When he decided to do so, he took the corpse by its legs, allowing it to drop into the small corridor between the 2 rows of boards which were the beds for the 50 typhus patients, and dragged it across the bumpy earthen floor toward the door. The 2 steps which led up into the open air always constituted a problem for us since we were exhausted from a chronic lack of food. After a few months' stay in the camp, we could not walk up those steps, which were each about 6 inches high, without putting our hands on the door jambs to pull ourselves up. The man with the corpse approached the steps. Wearily he dragged himself up, then the body, first the feet, then the trunk, and finally, with an uncanny rattling noise, the head of the corpse bumped up the 2 steps. My place was on the opposite side of the hut, next to the small sole window which was built near the floor. While my cold hands clasped a bowl of hot soup from which I sipped greedily, I happened to look out the window. The corpse, which had just been removed, stared in at me with glazed eyes. 2 hours before I had spoken to that man. Now I continued sipping my soup. If my lack of emotion had not surprised me from the standpoint of professional interest, I would not remember this incident now, because there was so little feeling involved in it. Apathy, the blunting of the emotions, and the feeling that one could not care any more were the symptoms arising during the 2nd stage of the prisoner's psychological reactions, and which eventually made him insensitive to daily and hourly beatings. By means of this insensibility, the prisoner soon surrounded himself with a very necessary protective shell. Beatings occurred on the slightest provocation, sometimes for no reason at all. For example, bread was rationed out at our work site, and we had lined up for it. Once the man behind me stood off a little to one side, and that lack of symmetry displeased the SS guard. I did not know what was going on in the line behind me, nor in the mind of the SS guard, but suddenly I received 2 sharp blows on my head. Only then did I spot the guard at my side who was using his stick. At such a moment, it is not the physical pain which hurts the most, and this applies to adults as much as to punished children. It is the mental agony caused by the injustice, the unreasonableness of it all. Strangely enough, a blow which does not even find its mark can, under certain circumstances, hurt more than one that finds its mark. Once I was standing on a railway track in a snowstorm. In spite of the weather, our party had to keep on working. I worked quite hard at mending the track with gravel, since that was really the only way to keep warm. For only one moment I paused to get my breath and to lean on my shovel. Unfortunately, the guard turned around just then and thought I was loafing. The pain he caused me was not from any insults or any blows. That guard did not think it worth his while to say anything, or not to even swear a word, to the ragged, emaciated figure standing before him, which probably reminded him only vaguely of a human form. Instead, he playfully picked up a stone and threw it at me. That to me seemed the way to attract the attention of a beast, to call a domestic animal back to its job, a creature with which you have so little in common that you do not even punish it. The most painful part of beatings is the insult which they imply. At one time we had to carry some long, heavy girders over icy tracks. If one man slipped, he endangered not only himself, but all the others who carried the same girder. An old friend of mine had a congenitally dislocated hip. He was glad to be capable of working in spite of it, since the physically disabled were almost certainly sent to death when a selection took place. He limped over the track with an especially heavy girder, and seemed about to fall and drag the others with him. As yet I was not carrying a girder, so I jumped to his assistance without stopping to think. I was immediately hit on the back, rudely reprimanded, and ordered to return to my place. A few minutes previously, the same guard who struck me had told us deprecatingly that we pigs lacked the spirit of comradeship. Another time, in a forest with a temperature at 2 degrees Fahrenheit, we began to dig up the topsoil, which was frozen hard, in order to lay water pipes. By then I'd grown rather weak physically. Along came a foreman with chubby, rosy cheeks. His face definitely reminded me of a pig's head. I noticed that he wore lovely, warm gloves in that bitter cold. For a time he watched me silently. I felt that trouble was brewing, for in front of me lay the mound of earth, which showed exactly how much I'd dug. And then he began. "You pig! I've been watching you the whole time. I'll teach you to work yet. Wait till you dig dirt with your teeth. You'll die like an animal. In 2 days I'll finish you off. You've never done a stroke of work in your life. What were you, swine, a businessman?" I was past caring, but I had to take his threat of killing me seriously. So I straightened up and I looked him directly in the eye. I was a doctor, a specialist. "What? A doctor? I bet you got a lot of money out of people." As it happens, I did most of my work for no money at all, in clinics for the poor. But now I'd said too much. He threw himself on me and knocked me down, shouting like a madman. I can no longer remember what it was he shouted. I want to show with this apparently trivial story that there are moments when indignation can rouse even a seemingly hardened prisoner. Indignation not about cruelty or pain, but about the insult connected with it. That time blood rushed to my head because I had to listen to a man judge my life who had so little idea of it. A man, I must confess, the following remark, which I made to my fellow prisoners after the scene, afforded me some childish relief, who looked so vulgar and brutal that the nurse in the outpatient ward in my hospital would not even have admitted him to the waiting room. Fortunately, the capo in my working party was obligated to me. He'd taken a liking to me because I listened to his love stories and matrimonial troubles, which he'd poured out during the long marches to our worksite. I'd made an impression on him with my diagnosis of his character and with my psychotherapeutic advice. After that he was grateful, and this had already been of value to me. On several previous occasions he had reserved a place for me next to him in one of the first 5 rows of our detachment, which usually consisted of 280 men. That favor was important. We had to line up early in the morning while it was still dark. Everybody was afraid of being late and of having to stand in the back rows. If men were required for an unpleasant and disliked job, the senior capo appeared and usually collected the men he needed from the back rows. These men had to march away to another, especially dreaded kind of work under the command of strange guards. Occasionally, the senior capo chose men from the first 5 rows just to catch those who tried to be clever. All protests and entreaties were silenced by a few well-aimed kicks, and the chosen victims were chased to the meeting place with shouts and blows. However, as long as my capo felt the need of pouring out his heart, this could not happen to me. I had a guaranteed place of honor next to him. But there was another advantage, too. Like nearly all the camp inmates, I was suffering from edema. My legs were so swollen, and the skin on them so tightly stretched, that I could scarcely bend my knees. I had to leave my shoes unlaced in order to make them fit my swollen feet. There would not have been space for socks even if I had had any, so my partly bare feet were always wet and my shoes always full of snow. This, of course, caused frostbite and chilblains. Every single step became real torture. Clumps of ice formed on our shoes during our marches over snow-covered fields, Over and over again, men slipped, and those following behind stumbled on top of them. Then the column would stop for a moment, but not for long. One of the guards soon took action and worked over the men with the butt of his rifle to make them get up quickly. The more to the front of the column you were, the less often you were disturbed by having to stop and then make up for lost time by running on your painful feet. I was very happy to be the personally appointed physician to His Honor the Capo, and to march in the first row at an even pace. As an additional payment for my services, I could be sure that as long as soup was being dealt out at lunchtime at our worksite, he would, when my turn came, dip the ladle right to the bottom of the vat and fish out a few peas. This capo, a former army officer, even had the courage to whisper to the foreman whom I'd quarreled with that he knew me to be an unusually good worker. That didn't help matters, but he nevertheless managed to save my life, one of the many times it was to be saved. The day after the episode with the foreman, he smuggled me into another work party. So that's it for this reading, and I hope that you guys are enjoying Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and I am going to continue reading tomorrow, 2 p.m. Pacific time. Thanks again. Bye.